Okay. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Awesome. I've been lucky enough to speak at NDC Oslo before. I have to say, the amps that are taller than me are new. That makes me feel like a real rock star. But it is kind of intimidating. Welcome to the talk. We're here today to talk about survival under fire. My name is Arthur Doler, or Art. Take your pick. I am an engineer, a software engineer. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a neurologist. I'm not anything to do with brains except a hobbyist. I love brains, not in a weird zombie way or anything, but I love learning about them. I love finding out what we are learning about them, what psychologists are learning about them, and I love taking those things and applying them to our jobs, to figuring out how we can build better software, how we can be better coworkers, how we can be better people. I work for a company in Omaha, Nebraska, in the United States. You've never heard of it, but they let me come and do cool stuff like this, so they get a slide. 2020 and 2021 were sure a heck of a couple years, huh? And then 2022 came along and told 2021 to just basically hold its beer. And since then, we've had 2023 and 2024. I'm not sure how I'm going to continue topping these slides because it just keeps seeming like it's not going to stop. It's been an absolute, unending chaos roller coaster ride. It's been awful. And everything has been topped by everything else. We've had wildfires, hurricanes, natural disasters, civil unrest, multiple sets of ongoing wars, including in Europe. And, there was that whole novel pandemic of a coronavirus thing, which led to us trying to work from home with our families there. It led to endless Zoom calls with the rest of our families there. It led to us trying to figure out how to exercise, how to order takeout, how to binging TV shows with the rest of our family there. But, your pets loved it anyhow, so. And if you didn't happen to live with your family, it was almost worse. I remember a tweet from the pandemic that was saying, basically, I spend time with the medium screen until it's time to go spend time with the big screen, until it's time to go spend time with the small screen until I fall asleep, which is simultaneously funny and also extremely depressing. Our lives contracted, they changed. We experienced uncertainty and confusion. We experienced frustration and anger. We experienced fear, and we experienced sadness. And all of these in amounts way larger than we normally would have. We reconsidered where we work. We reconsidered how we work. We even reconsidered where we live and why we work at all. All, and again, in a remarkably short period of time. Today, we're going to talk about what went on during the pandemic in your brain and what's gone on in the, again, increasingly atrocious years since. We're going to talk about your brain and you, and then we're going to talk about a metaphor for various portions of your brain called the walled gardens in the dark forest. We're going to talk about your brain being on fire and how you deal with it, and how to survive being on fire. And then we're going to talk about how to prepare for the next thing, whatever that happens to be, that's going to top everything else that's happened since. So to summarize the last couple of years, we have thought a tremendous number of thoughts and felt a tremendous number of emotions. Again, and often in a relatively short period of time. Psychologists have a word for that. They call it stress, which is remarkably anodyne and succinct for something that is as catastrophic. When stress gets too bad, they call it trauma. If you lost a friend or a relative to COVID-19, if you were scared for your job, for your life, you probably experienced trauma. You found the world shifting around you, whole things different, literally on a daily basis when you woke up. That can be traumatic. But trauma is really a complicated and a fraught term, and especially in kind of the modern context online, it gets used in places that that conflates it. It doesn't really make it a clear thing, and it becomes very muddled and very washed out. So I much prefer the metaphor, the term, brain indigestion, which I picked up from a therapist, Britt Frank, who's written a number of good books. I love this metaphor because Britt Frank describes brain indigestion as anything that is too much, too soon, or too often for your brain to handle. And it's great because, frankly, it works. The metaphor is amazing. You can get indigestion from one big horrible thing, or a bunch of tiny little things, or even something that's normally okay with just a little something else on top of it. More importantly, indigestion is relative. Something that utterly wrecks your system can be fine for someone else to eat, and vice versa. Your demographics or your lived history or any number of things about you can define what things give you brain indigestion or real indigestion. And when you get indigestion, you don't feel like you failed. I mean, you may feel like you made some very bad life choices, especially say last night, but you don't feel like you made a mistake when you get indigestion, like you're a broken human being. And you also don't feel broken when somebody else gets indigestion and you don't. Well, okay, so I've been up here talking for a couple of minutes already. What does any of that have to do with a software conference and arguably your jobs? This is the only reason they let me come and talk, is because I apply this stuff to your work. I mean, and the answer is that we tend to think that we are capable of leaving the big human mess of who we are outside of work. There's a show on Apple TV that people keep telling me to watch that I've not watched yet, mostly because I think I would be extremely upset by it, called Severance. Anybody seen it? It's a show where they put a little brain implant in you, and you go to work, and then they turn off your personality and your memory, and you become somebody different. And then you leave work, and they turn it off again, and you become but you, with no memory of what happened. And of course, this breaks down, and it's all Black Mirror-y and catastrophic. That's not how the human brain works. When you have emotions, they stick with you. They persist, they affect you. We'll talk a little more about that later. But in the modern era, we tend to think the brain is the be-all, end-all of everything. In classical Greek, they didn't actually think that was true. They thought the heart was the seat of human rational emotion. In Egypt, actually, back in the several periods in which they practiced mummification, they would take the brain. They thought so little of it, they would actually yank it out through your nose with this little hook after you were dead and just throw it on the floor. Totally did not get preserved. They'd preserve things like your liver, but not the brain, because they didn't think it was important. But today, we think the brain is everything. We view it as this infinitely expanding organ that is capable of just everything in the world. And don't get me wrong, brains are amazing. They can do so much. We can learn to do so much. We can learn to be so much. But it's not capable of everything. It has limits. This idea is called the neurocentric bias, that our brains are the seat of everything that makes us human, everything that makes us us, and the body is kind of this meat sack hanger-on that just floats around with us. But I bet I can convince you that you agree with me. How many of you used an alarm clock to get up today? Yep. Every one of you agrees that the brain has a limit, that we can't magically wake ourselves up. Seems small, but it's true. The brain by itself has limits. And most importantly, your brain is already part of a bunch of other systems, things that affect it, both inside of your body and outside of your body. The culture you grew up in, what you ate, are you hydrated enough? All of those things can affect your mental cognition. It's like a controller with a bunch of injected dependencies. Again, I'm making technical references, so they'll let me speak at conferences. We can inject more systems into our brains to help us with our lives. Things like alarm clocks, notebooks, whatever your note-taking system is, whether it's physical, digital, things like assistants. All of those things can become a literal part of your brain. This idea is called the extended mind. That we extend into these things, these structures and capabilities that give us more features to our brain. This is also actually called extended cognition in some places, because people actually think that this is a way that we think. We think literally through other objects. Which makes a bit of narrative sense, right? We view humans as tool users. That's one of the things that sets us apart from most of the animals in the animal kingdom. And while your brain isn't a computer, it does have this finite throughput capacity, this ability to handle things. This is called working memory. It represents your ability to work with a simultaneous number of things, to hold them in your mind and juggle them. You've probably heard of the 7 plus or minus 2 rule, right? That's the number of things human beings can remember in their short-term memory. Now that's a little fuzzy. Modern research has shown that that number can vary a lot and is often quite smaller than that. But it's kind of the way that it helps to think about the brain, that you have a finite number of slots that you can really fit things into at any given point in time. This is why when you're coding, things like abstraction and refactoring help you. Because if you refactor a method out, and with a single good name for it, that becomes what's called a chunk in psychology. And when you chunk something, now it's only one thing instead of several things. There's a whole book on this called The Programmer's Brain by Philion Hermans. I definitely recommend reading that if you ever get, if that stuff was interesting to you. But these systems can be disrupted. And that can disrupt our ability to manage and process the world around us, to navigate the world around us. And you might not even notice that fact. You might just think you personally are failing. So why does that happen to us? Well, to talk about that, we have to talk about the walled garden and the dark forest. I would like you to think of your brain as separated into 2 regions. And the first of those, the conscious mind, the part of the brain that you think of as you, I want you to think of that part living inside of this very nice, very lovely walled garden with very tall, thick walls, kind of in the middle of your brain. Conscious, intentional self is actually a fairly small part of what your brain does most of the time. This is your intentional self, the self you think of as you, the self that acts with intent. Outside of the walled garden is the dark forest. And this is everything else that your brain does. This is your autonomous self, the portion of your brain that acts without intention, or without intention that is necessarily visible to you. We tend to call this the subconscious, but I prefer this name from Gleb Sapersky because I think it helps explain really what's going on. It's not unconscious per se, it's more that it's just got its own agenda. It has its own things that it cares about. And the key factor here is that your intentional self cannot see outside of this walled garden. All we really can do is throw messages over the wall, and something out there in the dark forest yeets a message back at us. But we don't know what answered or why it answered the way it did. All we have is the message. And in fact, again, the vast bulk of what goes on in your brain is not under your conscious control and not even something you can see. You don't even have access to it. You can't even perceive that it's going on. Your intentional self is largely not in control of your own brain. The fact that you disagree with me is called the introspection illusion. You feel like you can see into many aspects of your brain and that you can construct stories about why it's acting the way it is and why you're behaving the way you are. You really can't do any of that, but you really, really feel like you can. So let me give you an example. When messages come over the wall, you have a chance, your intentional self has a chance to look at them and evaluate them and decide if they're valuable. So when a message like this comes across, your intentional self could take the time and sit down and build a whole list of pros and cons. But this takes energy. And in terms of energy for your brain, that means sugar. It takes sugar to process this. This is actually part of why your brain is split up like this in the first place. It's an energy-saving device. This actually also causes uncomfortable cognitive dissonance. We have to kind of hold 2 ideas in our head at the same time, and our brain really doesn't like to do that. It feels weird and squishy. So, what we do instead is we start from this assumption that that is a thing I think, or that is a thing I feel, or that is a thing I believe. And we construct a story for why that's true. We work with the autonomous self. The intentional self works with the autonomous self to build that story, to fill in a story that feels right to us. This is called confabulation. So, as an example, if you don't like avocados, you could say, avocados are a little slimy, and every time I eat avocados, I get a little nauseated, and that's why I don't like avocados. Seems reasonable. But what could actually be going on is that when you were 3, you went to Disney World with your parents. It was 110 degrees in the shade. It was the first time you'd had avocados, and you proceeded to get heat stroke and then throw avocados up through your nose. You don't remember this. Your parents absolutely do, but you do not have an active memory of this experience. But that somatic experience, the lingering association of avocados and nausea, sticks in darker recesses of your brain, in the dark forest. And that's why you don't actually like avocados. Psychologists call the reasons you do the things you do, the reasons I do the things I do, the antecedents of our behavior. And what they say is that the antecedents of our behavior are hidden from us, that we do not understand why we behave the way we do. Arguably, we cannot understand the way we behave the way we do, because it's locked in portions of our brain that we don't have access to. This is compounded by the fact, or perhaps in part because of the fact, that our intentional self is really just an exception handler for our autonomous self. As long as you're doing familiar things in familiar environments and familiar surroundings, we tend to just run on autopilot. The autonomous self does its thing. So for instance, if you are driving to work or walking to work or biking to work, you are often not focused on the drive. How many of you have ever gotten to work, whether you walked there, biked there, drove there, and you do not remember that experience? I would like you to keep your hands up. Look around the room. That should be freaking terrifying, right? Especially in the US, where it's like most of us take cars to work. Okay, we're driving these huge 2-ton vehicles and I don't remember it. You can put your hand down, thank you. That should be terrifying, but it's normal. Because we kind of understand that that's how the autonomous system works. That it frees us up. It takes the wheel and says, you go think your big brain thoughts over here about the tacos you're gonna have for dinner or the code you've gotta write today. We'll do the driving. But you'd better believe that if you see an elephant in the road, your autonomous self is going to go, excuse me, I would like some assistance, please. I am not prepared for this eventuality. They expect your conscious self to take over at that point. Novelty is a thing that your conscious, intentional self is good at handling, or at least better at handling than your autonomous self. And when we are on autopilot, when we are tired, when we are exhausted, when we are afraid, when we are emotional, when we're too busy thinking about everything else that we have to do and all of the state of the world and how it is actively on fire at any given point, we often skip the step of examining the messages coming from the dark forest. We just look at them and we believe them. We look at them and we say, that is the thing I feel, that is the thing I think, and we're just going to go with it. And the dark forest itself isn't just one thing, it is all of these other processes. It is a multitude of things that your brain has evolved to do over time. Your intentional self is a really thin veneer over a lot of other selves. It is a howling parliament of voices, clamoring for your attention, crying out to tell you things that they think are important, that they think are novel, that they think you should care about. But they're not really tuned for life in the 21st century. They're from an older, darker time. They're wolves. And sometimes, when your intentional self is sitting in the walled garden, you can hear the wolves howl in the distance. And sometimes, they are right up against the walls, and you can't think of anything else. And sometimes the wolves are pelting you with so many messages that there is no possible way you could deal with them or process them all. And sometimes it is just one message over and over and over and over again. These wolves are running a distributed denial of service attack on your brain. They're taking up your working memory. They are forcing you to focus on them, on the howling, and instead of on the things that you actually need to be paying attention to. They're filling your cognition with noise. If you, as a developer or someone in the development adjacent fields, should know one psychologist, it is Donald Norman. Donald Norman has done a ton of research on UX and on psychology of UX and design. Donald Norman talks about, in his book, Emotional Design, how your emotions, what psychologists call your affective experience, affects your cognition. If I tell you that you are smart and you are strong and you are beautiful and that you are wonderful, which to be fair is true, if I make you feel good, you actually perform better on cognitive tasks. And conversely, if I make you feel afraid, stupid, scared, anxious, nervous, busy, then you perform worse. You are literally dumber. You see these things all over the internet. Negative affect can diminish your cognition, and there are sites out there who perform what are called dark patterns of UX that are literally trying to get you to be dumber by making you afraid, by making you feel like you're going to miss a deal, like you're going to miss out, by putting urgency into their literally everywhere. This is booking.com. It's bad. Kayak in the United States, they don't have it here, but at least they used to in the US. They have a little timer that ticks down in the bottom right until your time expires. That's all just to make you dumber so that you make a bad decision and buy something through their website. Stress diminishes your ability to think and your ability to control your own attention. Stress causes you to act impulsively. It causes you to act irrationally. So, all right, what happens when our routines are disrupted? When we're cut off from family and friends, from all of our support structures and all of our external structures, and we're suddenly feeling afraid and confused and lonely all the time? Our brain screams at us, that's what. It tells us that nothing is going right, that everything is wrong and everything is a problem. Emotional responses overwhelm your cognitive responses. The wolves are howling. Initially, during the pandemic, what's called the sympathetic nervous system kept us going, right? This is what people refer to as the fight, flight, or freeze response. That thing that happens when the more animal portion of your brain kind of kicks in and goes, we got to deal with this. We survived on that energy, on the adrenaline. And we relied pretty heavily on the autonomous self in those initial days. We sought comfort wherever we could get it, wherever we'd gotten it in the past, regardless of if that was healthy or not. And we sought control. We wanted to establish control over our situation however we could. This is actually called the compensatory control model. If you cannot control vast swaths of your environment, certain situations in your life, you seek to control other things so you can actually get some control somewhere. This is why the toilet paper thing happened. I mean, yes, there's other reasons because of the whole how the production worked. But the people going out and just buying toilet paper, the reason why is because, I mean, this was in the time period where we didn't even know if it was airborne or not, right? We were wiping down groceries with alcohol pads. Like, you look back and this is some weird ritual we all did for a little while. We had no idea what was going on. But toilet paper, I can get toilet paper. We are set for toilet paper for the next 20 years. I solved that problem. After a while, we acclimate to that adrenaline, that constant drip And things started to appear normal, or at least the new normal. But the stress of the high emotional responses that we're still going through is kind of taking its toll on us. We found ourselves starting to build new rituals, new routines, not always healthy ones, that helped us deal with our new situation, our new lives. We found other ways to feel in control of situations. Because emotionally, again, we have that need to feel in control. It is an actual thing that we as humans need to feel good about our lives. And eventually, individually, every one of us hit what we called the pandemic wall. Depression, malaise, brain fog. That was a normal human response. Those are normal human responses to abnormal times, to abnormal events. And if you felt those things, you weren't alone. Your brain is not designed to run at 100% for days, or weeks, or months, or years. It's just not how we're built. We're not meant to be the ultimate rational actors. We can't achieve this ideal, even if you think that is an ideal to actually strive for. We found ourselves burnt out, right? And eventually we encountered a lack of forward progress on anything that mattered. We started encountering emotional problems, physical health problems, brought on by stress, by anxiety, even diagnosable mental issues. Again, brought on by the situation, things that would have never happened to us prior. So what do you do when that happens? Right? I could end the talk here, but that would be extremely depressing, right? So what do you do? Let's bring this back up. What can we actually do about these things? So let's talk about surviving the immediate fire. What happens when you find yourself in the thick of it again? First, and arguably most importantly, you need to recognize that your capacity is diminished. That the wolves will be howling for the foreseeable future, and you cannot be as smart as you normally are. More than a year ago at this point, actually, it was a year ago in November, my cat was diagnosed with cancer. And we decided not to operate because he was 16 and he's not going to have a great life if we go through with it. 16-year-old cat on chemo is not great. So we decided to just go through with it, but to let him live until he lived another year, like a literal another year. Because they said it's going to be like weeks, not months. And then a year later, we're like, which is great. We got to spend more time with him, and that was good. But I did not take the diagnosis well. I was grappling with that emotionally, and thankfully, I've done a bunch of research on this stuff, and I knew that I had to go into my team and talk to them, and I did. Sat down with my team, and I'm like, okay, so this is the situation. I have a cat has cancer, not dealing with it well. I'm gonna be dumber for probably the next couple months. I'm not gonna be as smart as I am. I'm not gonna be as effective as I am. I'm not gonna be as productive as I normally am. And that's all true. You have to recognize that you are going to need to scale back, that you have to let some things go. Because if you keep trying to hold yourself to the standard that you have held yourself to up until this point, it's going to make it worse. Because now you're not living up to your own standards on top of everything else. And that's one more voice in your head howling, which you just don't need. Cut back your news consumption. Yeah. I joke, get rid of your social media too, right? At least scale back. Cut back on anything that asks you to consume it in a fire hose. Because those things, we invented new words during the pandemic, right? Doom scrolling was a literal thing that we started doing. You don't want to be forced into a situation where you're forced to consume content at a breakneck pace. Find ways to disengage. Go touch grass, as the kids say. Connect with nature, connect with whatever. You don't have to go full Snow White with it, but just go, spend some time on a beach, go stare at a tree. I don't care. Find some way to disconnect, some way to engage. Because, not to sound weird about it or all hippie, but we did actually evolve as a species that engage with nature on a regular basis. And it is something that can help us mentally. But more importantly, it gets you out of the house, it gets you out of some of your routines, at least until winter comes and then you've got to figure things out. Try to seek control in limited, useful fashion, okay? Or reasonable fashion, even if it isn't useful. There was a point during the pandemic where everybody suddenly bought paint and like all of these home renovation supplies. This is again what we were trying to do, trying to retain control, to gain control over a situation. I literally did this. I painted my partner's bedroom in like purple and pink stripes. It looks great. It cost a whole bunch because the paint had skyrocketed in price, but I don't regret it. It gave us that moment of control, of feeling like we owned this space that we were in. And that matters a lot. It made us feel better. How do you bounce back from these situations once you've survived that immediate fire? Can we even do it? Well, of course we can. What am I doing up here talking if we can't? So here's some strategies for recovery. The first step, recovering from burnout. The first thing that you can do is do more stuff. Now that sounds weird if you don't know how burnout works. Burnout is not just about doing too much work. Burnout is a stress management problem. In fact, I have a whole 1-hour talk talking about burnout. You could probably find it on YouTube. And it might seem paradoxical to add more work to it, but if you can find an activity, something where you're volunteering, something where you're helping, where you can see the value that you put into the world, that can actually dramatically lessen your feelings of burnout and make you feel like you're in control of at least something. You can also establish work-life boundaries. Yeah, I know, right? Especially with software, especially in something like the pandemic where these things went away instantly because suddenly work is right here and then bed's right there. Like there's no separation. I knew folks who actually started doing fake commutes where they would like spend 10 minutes walking up and down stairs before they sat down to work, literally to give themselves a mental separation from the work, to give them anything to build that boundary back. We need to talk about how to recover emotionally. So the pandemic isolated us from a lot of our relationships. You know, we spent time virtually with people, but it's not the same. And what happened is a lot of people have either let those relationships diminish in importance or they just didn't pick them back up again. And I want to encourage you to go pick them back up again. Go talk to old friends. Go find people that you did activities with before and re-engage in those activities. Reconnect with family and friends. That is going to give you an emotional base that will help you return, help you stabilize the emotions you're experiencing, and help you return to your own emotional baseline. Although you might have to decide which of those are worth resuming. In some ways, the pandemic was a little bit of a gift because it gave us a chance to sever some relationships that might have been harmful. And maybe you need to establish some boundaries on other relationships before you pick them back up. And that can be helpful too. Being intentional about your relationships. Asking yourself, what do I get out of this? I mean, it seems a little transactional to say about friends, right? But if you have a friend that you don't really enjoy their time, what are you doing? Is they really your friend? There's also therapy, kind of the big old go-to, right? Process your emotions, work on your boundaries. Yeah, I mean, you can think about this as you're paying for a friend, somebody that has to listen to you, and they can't run away. Therapy isn't drastic, right? It doesn't have to be a thing that you wait until everything has exploded and then you go in and it's all very terrible. It could just be a thing that you go, I'm going through a tough time and I just want somebody to talk to for a little while. Somebody that can give me some perspective. Somebody that maybe can give me a couple tips and techniques, can help me reframe and recontextualize my experiences. There's other kinds of therapy. CBT is a really interesting one. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, talks about, well, it's really about training your autonomous self. It talks about how your thoughts affect your behaviors and how your behaviors affect your feelings And then you get more complex, and there's actually a little backward cycle with all of it, how those things feed back into each other. And it's about trying to put your finger on the scale, about trying to affect the things that are coming from the dark forest, or at least being more cognitively intentional about the things coming from the dark forest. But the emotional stuff is going to take time. It's not going to be all right immediately. You could argue it's not even all right now. So let's talk about physical problems. What can you do about those? Well, first, I'm going to give you permission, especially the guys in the room, to go see your doctors about medical things. Speaking as somebody who spent way too long walking on a heel with an Achilles tendonitis, because I'm like, it'll be fine, everything's great. Yeah, no, go see your doctor. Yeah, it might be dumb. You might feel like less of a man for it. I don't care, go see your doctor. And I give you permission to take as much time as you need with the recovery from all of this, okay? Even the physical stuff is going to take a while to heal. Most importantly, out of all of this, I want you to remember that the old adage about what doesn't kill you makes you stronger is nonsense. It's fake, it's not real. What doesn't kill you can leave you damaged, leave you scarred, leave you weakened. You are not going to be automatically better or stronger as a result of a chaotic, traumatic experience. Brain indigestion is not going to make you better automatically. You have to process that experience. You have to engage with it cognitively, chewing them, breaking them down. Emotionally, feeling those emotions and letting them flow. You have to find your path going forward. Figure out what it is you want to be doing. What about the next time something happens? The inevitable next time that something happens? Well, how do you protect yourself? The first way, and arguably the most important way, is back to talk about those external systems. To look at what are the external systems that you rely on. Which ones can you add to help you out? You want to be building habits now that will help you in the future. Ideally, things that you can do with minimal equipment, minimal other persons, in case there is something like, say, another global pandemic, as opposed to a global endemic, which is what COVID is now. The pandemic, like I said, did give us a couple things. It gave us a bit of perspective. It separated us from a bunch of those habits, a bunch of those routines. Pick and choose which ones you want to keep going forward. Be intentional about it. Which ones give you the most benefit? It forced us into a wider perspective. Use that perspective. Use that disconnect between who you were and who you are now. Because you don't have to remain the same person. Arguably, most of us don't. It's just that the change isn't as sudden, isn't as dramatic as it has been. Figure out where you would like to be and try to determine the steps to get there. Because we often fall into patterns and routines. I realize I could have picked any one of a dozen stories about tube strikes in London, but this one's from 2014, and the reason that this specific one is important is that there was a really important study published around this. When the news of the strikes came out, a bunch of social psychologists went, great, natural experiment. You know, they love this, right? Anything happens, they're like, great, we can do a paper about this. I'm mostly jealous. I wish my job was that interesting most of the time. But they sat down and they found a bunch of people who commuted to work on the tube. And they said, all right, here's how what station do you get on? You do this is how long it takes, et cetera. And then they interviewed them when the strike happened and said, how are you getting to work now? When the strike ended, they went back to those folks and interviewed them again. How are you getting to work? Everybody had picked a different manner of transportation to get from work or get to work, right, when the tube wasn't there. Most of them did not go back to the tube. Instead, they stuck with the new thing because it was better for them, because it was whatever the benefits were, right? They found it better for them to do this new thing. Why would that be true if we found the best thing first, as we tend to think we do, as we tend to think we optimize, right? That we go out and we find the best thing and then we just do that thing over and over again. We don't. We do the first thing and then we, speaking of chaos and unexpected things, right? We don't find the best thing first. We find the first thing first and then we just do that because it's easy, because the autonomous system takes over. External systems help you free up working memory. And the more you practice those things, the more they move into what's called procedural memory. Take as an example, driving, or anything where you're doing something physical. The first times you do it, you have to think about the muscle movements. The example I tend to use is turning left when driving a car is a phenomenally complex musculoskeletal movement that involves several limbs, your feet, your head, visually recognizing a whole bunch of different objects and whether it's clear or not. And we just kind of pack all of that down over time into turn left, so that your GPS will literally tell you, turn left. And we know what we're doing. And our muscles and everything else follow suit. This procedural memory helps us. It allows us to execute without thinking about it. You're pushing things into the autonomous self because when things go to hell, you will be using that autonomous self anyway. And so the things inside of it that it thinks are habits, that it knows are routines, if you've intentionally decided what those are, you will be better off. Mindfulness meditation is another one. If you've seen one of my talks before, you've probably seen this slide. Mindfulness meditation is a fantastic way to be paying attention to the interplay between the conscious self and the autonomous self, between the intentional self and the autonomous self. Noticing what those messages are that pass back and forth. And being able to, I don't know about you, my brain thinks a whole mess of dumb things all the time. Like constantly. And it was really liberating to turn around and realize that I don't have to believe every stupid thought my brain has. Think about what you need to be able to always do those things. Mindfulness meditation is a perfect example because typically you only need the breath. But if exercising is your thing, buy basic weights. Maybe buy a treadmill. Or focus on buying things outside first, like running stuff outside. Whatever works for you, within your budget and your constraints, but you want to make sure you have those things and that they're part of that routine, so you're using them, so it's autonomous. And finding rituals in your life. Humans are wired for ritual. I just actually this year wrote a whole talk on rituals, which is really cool. Establishing personal rituals can provably help your anxiety in times of stress. You can think of it as this little moment of control. It kind of kicks your brain over into this strange mode where you almost practice make-believe, really. Take your routines and ritualize them. If you are, for instance, say a coffee person, turn that into a ritual. I mean, for a lot of coffee people, it almost is already. But put your mug in the same place every time. Make the coffee exactly the same way. Stir the same number of times. Use items and materials that have meaning to you. The more meaningful, symbolically meaningful you can make that ritual, the more it will be effective. And the more repetitive and rigid the ritual, the more it will be effective. Look for actual support groups, family, friends, social organizations, religious organizations, fraternal organizations, whatever floats your boat. You just have to be ready, because if it is, say, something like another global pandemic, your support network is likely to look like this, right? Because everyone's all being affected at once. And so everybody's kind of flipping out. But again, that camaraderie, that shared experience with each other can be comforting. What can you solve beforehand so you don't have to think about it? So that it no longer becomes a thing taking up part of your working memory. For example, what do you actually need to have on hand for an emergency in wherever you live? I live in Omaha, Nebraska in the United States, which is, if you put your finger on the center of the country and you just go up a little bit, that's where I live. We do not get, for instance, hurricanes, because you have to go through 2 states to get to any ocean from where I live. It's the only like triply landlocked state in the United States. So I don't have to worry about hurricanes. I do have to worry about tornadoes or hail. Earlier this week, actually, I was getting all fun like photos from my coworkers of hailstones about that big and all of their claims about insurance. Like, oh, my car is dead now. Like, oh, good, that's fine. My house appears to be fine, thankfully. But, you know, being prepared for that eventuality, making sure that I have, say, like visqueen and tape so that I can tape up my windows if a hailstone happens to break them. That's a thing I actually need on hand. I do not need 300 pounds of freeze-dried food that you can find on some like prepper websites. I do need what they say is up to 72 hours of food, a 72-hour kit, that much food and water. So figure out what you need for your area and lay that in. We actually started during the pandemic having a food rotation. So we take the 72-hour kit and we rotate food, new food into it and old food out of it and eat that. Where are you going if you need to evacuate? Have you talked about it with your family? Have you drilled it as a plan? Have you done it enough that it's autonomous? Yeah, that looks dumb. Yes, it sounds dumb. Does it work? It absolutely works. But you also need to be careful. If you've flown on an airplane in the last forever, you've probably seen this. It comes from the portion of the airplane safety briefing where they say, an unlikely event of loss of cabin pressure, oxygen mask will drop from the ceiling. Grasp the mask between the finger and the thumb and stretch the band over the back of your head, etc. They go on and they basically say, if you're traveling with somebody who needs assistance, you put your own oxygen mask on first. And the reason you do that is because if you help them first and they can't help you back, you will help them and then you will pass out and die from lack of oxygen. You put your own oxygen mask on first. Ensure that you are okay. Do not accept new obligations without ensuring that you will be okay first, that you will be able to take care of yourself. Because often our support habits are the first thing we drop on the floor when the nonsense hits the fan. It is a weird and frustrating quirk of human experience that I personally have also experienced. Oh, things are a little stressful. Well, I'll skip the gym today. I have too much work. I can't do that. That's exactly what you need to be doing, is spending the time and going out with friends when you are overworked, because that's what you need to recover, to be more effective at work. Keep doing those things. Luckily, one of the best places to do a bunch of this is the places you've been for the last couple days. Hopefully, while you were here, you spent time listening. You spent time playing, you spent time growing, and you spent time reconnecting with others. Because I want you to leave here today invigorated, renewed in your desire to write great code, to solve huge problems, and to do good things, great things for other people. I want you to take all of the things we've talked about today and all of the things you've learned here and go forward, out into the world, ready to build your own systems of support to help you survive when the dark forest comes alive again. I want to thank you very much for listening. The slides will be available up at that bit.ly or the QR code. It's the same link. The video will be posted from NDC. So you have, watch it over again if you want. Yeah, if you have questions, I will be up here packing up, and then you can catch me for the rest of the conference. So thank you again for listening. Thank you very much.